Lieutenant Desmond L.S. Arthur, RFC. The Life and Death of an Aviator. Written by Barry Dominic Graham. Theme music composed and performed by Barry Dominic Graham. Narrated by Peter Baker. This book is profoundly dedicated to the memory of Lieutenant Desmond L.S. Arthur, RFC, and all the other valiant, fallen heroes of aviation. Lest we forget. Leonardo da Vinci, Italian polymath of the High Renaissance, 1452 to 1519, said, "Once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skywards." Foreword by Stuart Archibald, MASHC Chairman. As the chairman of the Montrose Air Station Heritage Centre, it is always rewarding to learn that the story of another one of our daring young men in his flying machine is to be brought back to life within books such as this one. Lieutenant Desmond Arthur was a young man of his time who dared to take up the challenge of conquering the newly discovered thrill of flight. Alas, his time was cut short, as with many young pilots who were involved in flying duties with the Royal Flying Corps in the pre-World War I period. Desmond is often referred to affectionately by members of the museum staff when the occasional piece of paper or sets of keys go missing and turn up mysteriously elsewhere. Some believe that Desmond still visits us, and we have gained a tremendous amount of media coverage about his alleged hauntings. Whether it is real or not, we still remain grateful for his memory and long-lasting assistance. Time, as ever, is constantly wearing away the memory of those who have gone before us. But knowing the author as well as I do, I am convinced that Barry will apply his usual high standard of sensitivity and will look to reveal as much of the memory of Desmond, past and present, as his considerable talents will lead him to discover. I have no doubt that this book will be well read, and who knows, perhaps Desmond will read the copy that will be left for him at the museum every evening. To Lieutenant Desmond L.S. Arthur, RFC, I say thank you for your past, present, and future in helping to support the Montrose Air Station Heritage Centre and Museum. Stuart Archibald, MASHC Chairman. Preface. It should be said that the character and history of Lieutenant Desmond L.S. Arthur have a certain charm which has engaged the interest of most, if not all, of those who ever knew anything about them. Aside from his intrepid and romantic nature, he was well known for his unassuming manner, optimism, and unfailing good spirit. Unfortunately, there is very little information available regarding the life and times of Lieutenant Arthur, but I have endeavored to garner as much as possible for this biography, brief as it is. My only hope is that I may ultimately serve his memory well and true. What information now exists is primarily due to the generosity and efforts of certain Arthur and Wilcox family descendants, subsequently being preserved and nurtured by the tireless and dedicated volunteers who staff and manage the wonderful Montrose Air Station Heritage Centre. My sole purpose is merely to keep alive the memory of someone whom I have no doubt whatsoever deserves to be remembered, as do so many others. It has been suggested in the past that Desmond Arthur was simply a daredevil who willingly courted death. But I personally would assert the opposite. I believe that people such as he are highly competent and trained individuals who possess a profound knowledge of themselves, being intrinsically driven to overcome their inherent fears by exploring their potential and pushing their limits ever further, resulting in an affirmation of life rather than the wish and pursuit of death. Barry D. Graham, author. Introduction. Lieutenant Desmond L.S. Arthur was an Irish aviator in No. 2 Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps. In the early morning of Tuesday, 27th of May 1913, while flying over the Scottish north-east coastal town of Montrose during a routine training flight from Upper Dysart to Lunan Bay, the right wing of his BE-2 biplane No. 205 suddenly collapsed due to a broken spar, which had hitherto remained unseen, as it had been concealed under the plane's fabric, possibly on purpose. Lieutenant Arthur was the first Irishman to be killed in an aircraft accident. He was buried with full military honours in Sleepy Hillock Cemetery of Montrose, being the first pilot to be interred there. His earthly life was one of courage, romance, and tragedy, which many avow has never ended. Desmond Phelps Perry Lucius Stoddart Arthur was born on the 31st of March in 1884 into an illustrious upper-class Irish family living in Glenomera House at Ballyquin, O'Brien's Bridge in County Clare. He was the second son of Thomas Lucius Jervis Arthur, circa 1847 to 1888, and Constance Helen Stoddart, circa 1859 to 1902, who was the daughter of William Steele Stoddart and Constance Massey of Clonboy, County Clare. The Arthurs were major landowners in Clare, owning 10,534 acres of land. They are stated to have been originally Arthurics, and to derive their descent from a common ancestor with the O'Briens, namely Cormac Cass, King of Munster. The name was anglicised in common with many others upon the invasion of Ireland by Henry II, who is stated to have conferred honours and grants of land on a royalist of that name in 1178. In the records of Limerick, the name of Arthur frequently occurs from the earliest period down to the time of Charles I, when the family estates in County Limerick were confiscated by Oliver Cromwell for supporting the royalist cause. The Arthurs then relocated to County Clare and became seated at Glenomera. Glenomera House was an early 18th century three-storey structure with projecting wings, which may possibly represent the original building. The house is said to have burnt down in 1905 and was not rebuilt. Thomas L. J. Arthur was the elder son of Reverend Lucius Arthur, circa 1810 to 1887, and Caroline Elizabeth Jervis, circa 1812 to 1869, daughter of John Haycock Jervis of Moseley, Birmingham, Warwickshire, and was born on the 30th of June in 1847. He was a lieutenant in the Durham Fusiliers and captain in the 6th Rifle Volunteers, being also the Justice of the Peace for County Clare. He married Constance Helen Stoddart on the 28th of April in 1881. When Thomas Smith Arthur, circa 1806 to 1884, who had suffered from mental illness, having been institutionalized in Dublin since the 1830s, died, the estate passed to his brother, the Reverend Lucius Arthur. Reverend Lucius was, however, actually living happily in a house at Matlock in Derbyshire, England, and never relocated to Ireland. His son, Thomas Lucius Jervis Arthur, Desmond's father, ultimately moved in instead, but sadly died shortly after his father, the Reverend Lucius Arthur. He left, as joint heirs to the Glenumera estate, his two young sons, Charles William Augustus Arthur, circa 1882 to 1937, and Desmond Phelps Perry Lucius Stoddart Arthur, circa 1884 to 1913. His widow, Constance, raised the family at Glenumera until 1894. After her marriage, when Desmond was 10, they thereafter lived with her second husband, William Pommier Ball, circa 1858 to 1902, in the salubrious surroundings of 71 Merrion Square in Dublin, the house which later became the home of Sybil Connolly and her couture studio. Unfortunately, both William and his wife Constance died in 1902, leaving the two young men, who already had the reputation of being somewhat unruly and fearless, with extreme financial security, but without parental guidance. Despite apparently not having been particularly close, both men joined the army together. Desmond thereupon would develop a profound passion for flying. Desmond's elder brother, Charles William Augustus Arthur, who was born on the 24th of September in 1882, became a captain in the City of Limerick Artillery and the Royal Munster Fusiliers. After leaving the army, he emigrated to India in 1909. Charles would have an adventurous but troubled life, which would include a divorce in 1921, criminal charges and incarceration in Paris for 13 months for fraud in 1924, a failed expedition to hunt for pirate treasure on an island off the coast of Costa Rica in 1934, and eventually bankruptcy in 1939, apparently after his death. He was married twice and had two sons, Charles Augustus Arthur, born and died 1905, living less than 1 month, and Lucius Charles Algernon Arthur, circa 1913 to 1992, both by his first wife, Violet Rose Roch Kelly, circa 1881 to 1927, the third daughter of John Joseph Roch Kelly of Roxtown Castle and Islandmore in Limerick. In 1930 he married Alice M.S. Aitken, alias Rodwell. He supposedly died in Barbados or Trinidad in around 1937. Desmond was schooled at Portora Royal Grammar School at Enniskillen, County Fermanagh, founded by the Royal Charter in 1608 by James I. He was mesomorphic in build, approximately 5 feet 8 inches in height, and a keen sportsman, winning a number of prizes in motoring speed trials, among others. After joining the Army, he soon became a lieutenant in the Army Motor Reserve in 1908, thereafter joining the 5th Battalion of the Royal Munster Fusiliers, formerly the South Cork Light Infantry, being promoted to lieutenant on the 27th of May in 1911, exactly 2 years to the day of his future death. On the 29th of August in 1910, whilst in attendance at the inaugural aviation meeting of the Aero Club of Ireland at Leopardstown Racecourse in Dunleary, Rathdown, Leinster, which was built by Captain George Quinn, circa 1842 to 1917, and modelled on Sandown Park Racecourse in England, he was introduced to Cecil Stanley Grace, circa 1880 to 1910, a pioneer aviator who went missing on a flight across the English Channel in 1910. It was this occasion which would fortify his desire for flying and ultimately seal his fate. On the 18th of June in 1912, Lieutenant Desmond L.S. Arthur attained his Royal Aero Club certificate, number 233, upon the completion of his flying trials in a Bristol Prier monoplane, designed for the Bristol and Colonial Aeroplane Company by Pierre Prier, in Brooklands Aviation Ground at Weybridge in Surrey, England. Now possessing his pilot's license, He soon transferred to the No. 2 Squadron of the newly formed Royal Flying Corps. No. 1 Squadron had been formed as a balloon squadron for artillery observation. In the first decade, following the dawn of the 20th century, the German Empire was rapidly expanding and would soon become a genuine threat to the security of the rest of Europe and, of course, Great Britain. They began to conclude that the North Sea should be regarded as their domain. Thus, in 1912, responding to the threat, the government of Britain, under the instructions of the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, began planning the creation of a dozen air stations to be operated by the recently formed Royal Flying Corps, RFC. In defence of the Royal Naval Fleet and their bases situated at Cromarty, Rosyth and Scapa Flow, it was logically decided that somewhere around the Scottish north-east coastal town of Montrose would provide the ideal locale for the first British air station. On the 13th of February in 1913, only 9 years and 58 days after the Wright brothers made their first powered flight, 5 aircraft belonging to the No. 2 Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps, 3 Morris Farman MF-11 Shorthorn and 2 BE-2s, under the command of Major Charles James Burke, DSO, that's Distinguished Service Order, took flight from RAE Farnborough, the Royal Aircraft Establishment in northeast Hampshire, heading northwards to Montrose. The 450-mile or 720-kilometre journey took, ironically, a total of 13 days to complete, having to be undertaken in carefully planned stages. On the 26th of February, the squadron landed about 3 miles or 4.8 kilometres south of Montrose on the sloping field of a bare, windswept farm known as Upper Dysart. In spite of this place being less than ideal, it was still utilised as a temporary base, making it the first operational military airfield to be established in Great Britain. Being naturally dissatisfied with the site, plus only having flimsy wood and canvas hangars, Major Burke surveyed the surrounding areas for a more suitable location, eventually finding the desired terrain at Broomfield Farm, about 1 mile or 1.6 kilometres north of Montrose, where the land was flat, being only 30 feet above sea level, in line with the prevailing wind and with good drainage due to the sandy soil. Being closer to the town and next to the railway line was also of great importance. He was given authority to relocate the air station to Broomfield at the end of 1913. Royal Engineers of the War Office's Directorate of Fortifications and Works erected 3 hangars of Indian Army shed design, known as Major Burke's Sheds, on the site. They were prefabricated at Glasgow before being transported to Montrose and erected in December of 1913. No. 2 Squadron moved to this base in the new year of 1914. Lieutenant Colonel Charles James Burke, DSO, 1882 to 1917, was a military aviation pioneer as well as an officer in the Royal Irish Regiment and the Royal Flying Corps, the younger son of Michael Charles Christopher Burke of Ballynahoon House, Amar Island. He was in command of No. 2 Squadron and subsequently the 2nd Wing, the 1st and 2nd Wings being created by necessity on the 29th of November in 1914. He began his British Army service in the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, being promoted to lieutenant on the 24th of October in 1900, seeing active service in the Second Boer War. His service also included 3 years with the West African Frontier Force, WAF. He was promoted to captain in September of 1909. In 1910, Burke learned to fly in a Farman biplane whilst in France, shortly thereafter gaining his Aero Club de France pilot certificate. Upon returning to England, he served in the School of Ballooning, known as the Balloon Factory, prior to becoming the Royal Aircraft Factory, where he was involved in training and testing experiments with airships and balloons, established at Chatham in Kent in 1888. On the 13th of May in 1912, he became the commanding officer of the No. 2 Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps and was promoted to Major. During the next 2 years, he trained his squadron in aerial reconnaissance. Although it was highly preferred that pilots be unmarried and weigh less than 11 stone 7 pounds, Charles Burke was not only 29 years old and married, but weighed well in excess of that which was desired, earning him the insensitive nickname of Pregnant Percy. Fortunately for him, his acceptance in the Royal Flying Corps was automatic, due to him being among the few army pilots attached to the School of Ballooning from which the Air Battalion grew. In 1916, there was a severe shortage of officers. Thus, Lieutenant Colonel Burke rejoined his old regiment, the Royal Irish Regiment. Tragically, he was killed in action on the 9th day of April in 1917, whilst commanding a battalion of the East Lancashire Regiment on the first day of the Battle of Arras. In 1912, Charles Burke wrote his 29 maxims for flying. 1. Time in the air will alone make a pilot. 2. When training pilots, no machine should go out without knowing what it is to do it, and it alone, then land. 3. When on the ground, everyone overrates their capacity for air work. 4. No young pilot should be allowed out in bumps until he has done at least 15 hours piloting. 5. An aeroplane will live in the wind and a lifeboat in any sea, but they both want good and experienced men at the tiller. 6. Each smash means a certain amount of loss of the valuable assets, dash and keenness, though varying with individuals, the supply has its limits. 7. A pilot whose muscles are rigid when flying should do one of two things: A. Unstiffen, B. Give up flying. 8. Napoleon Bonaparte said that in war the mental is to the physical as 3 to 1. If he had known aviation, he would have put a naught after the 3. 9. If the occupant of the passenger seat has no confidence in the pilot, there is probability of trouble. If it is the pilot who lacks confidence, the probability becomes a certainty. 10. In aviation, because a thing has been done without accident 10 times, is no guarantee that there will not be an accident on the 11th. 11. The qualities most required by a pilot: confidence; by an observer, truth; by a rigger, reliability; and the first two are largely based on the last. 12. Rumor is a lying jade. Aviation is full of rumors. 13. No pilots or anyone put over them will do any good if they listen to remarks actuated by jealousy. 14. Flying creates flying. If you see others up, the weather cannot be so bad as you imagined it was. 15. Divide pilots into classes. The weather will be fit for all of a class or none. 16. The amount of flying done does not depend on the weather, but on the arrangements made to avail oneself of good weather. 17. Sufficient arrangements are seldom, if ever, made. 18. Aviation, like arsenic, can only be taken in small doses at first. 19. When things are going well, the man in charge can give play to his fears. 20. Nothing is ever as good or as bad as it seems. 21. Waiting about on an aerodrome has spoilt more pilots than everything else put together. 22. Strain can reduce the best of pilots by stages until it is just as dangerous for them to fly a machine as it is for a beginner. 23. Everyone who takes up flying becomes converted from disbelief into enthusiasm. Shortly after his conversion, he may or may not kill himself. 24. Never regret having given a beginner too little flying at first, but always remember the time lost by want of arrangement. 25. If in doubt whether you should let beginners go up, don't. 26. A military flyer is only becoming really valuable after 6 months, which is about the time that a civilian flyer lasts as a star performer. 27. In aviation, all goes completely wrong or completely well. Neither should affect the man in charge as to what he intended to do. 28. If you know what you want, you can do your portion and get others to do theirs. Most people don't know what they want. 29. A squadron commander should want a good squadron and not be able to break records. In June of 1914, the Royal Flying Corps consisted of 5 aircraft squadrons, number 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. Number 1 squadron was still in the process of converting from balloons, while number 7 was still being formed. Upon the outbreak of World War I on the 4th of August in 1914, the military wing of the RFC was comprised of 147 officers and 1,097 men, with 179 aircraft. Amid the war, the RFC underwent expeditious augmentation, and by the end of 1916 had 46,000 personnel and 2,712 aircraft in 64 operational and 33 reserve squadrons. A year later, there were 10,938 aircraft in 115 operational and 109 training squadrons. The Flying Training School, as with many others, experienced frequent crashes as it built up a force of skilled pilots. There was no handbook telling the first instructors what methods they were to use in teaching their cadets wartime maneuvers in an aircraft. Although an instructor could be capable of teaching his students with profound insight, he was often so stressed and overworked that his expertise could be drastically impaired. Even accomplished pilots were always at risk due to the inherent dangers of flying. Desmond Arthur was only 29 years, 1 month, and 26 days old when he was tragically killed. Around 7 o'clock in the morning of the 27th of May in 1913, he took off from the temporary No. 2 Squadron Airfield at Upper Dysart Farm for a training flight above Lunan Bay in his Renault 70 horsepower, Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2C, Blériot experimental biplane No. 205, designed by Captain Sir Geoffrey de Havilland, circa 1882 to 1965, and Lieutenant Edward Teschmaker-Busk, circa 1886 to 1914. About 40 minutes later, whilst flying over Montrose, upon beginning his descent at approximately 2,500 feet, the upper right wing collapsed and broke off without warning due to a broken spar, which had hitherto remained unseen, as it had been concealed under the plane's fabric. The biplane subsequently went into a violent spin as it hurtled towards the ground. It remains unclear whether Lieutenant Arthur chose to jump from the cockpit or was thrown out, possibly due to his seat belt snapping, but nevertheless he fell over 2,000 feet to an instant death. The foreman of the Lunan House Estate farm, belonging to Captain Hugh Francis Blair Imrie, CMG, circa 1873 to 1942, reported seeing the biplane shortly before hearing a crashing sound, which accompanied the plane's brutal descent. Disturbingly, he also reported seeing a body plummeting to the earth. He described the person as falling perfectly straight and silently, with the arms held directly above the head. He fell for approximately 13 seconds. Medical assistance was quickly summoned to the scene. Lieutenant Arthur's shattered body was found 156 yards away from the mangled wreckage of his biplane, which had crashed near the Lunan Bay railway station, which was opened on the 1st of May in 1883 by the North British, Arbroath and Montrose Railway. Curiously, the Aeroplane magazine stated in an article that Lieutenant Arthur had taken the plane up for a preliminary test flight, and that it was flying splendidly. The initial investigation into the incident was conducted by the Royal Aero Club on the 2nd and 10th of June, which pronounced that an inadequate repair to a spar on the wing was the cause of the crash. It was stated that the plane had been built in June of 1912 and rebuilt again in August. There was a definite suspicion that accidental damage to the machine had been deliberately covered up by an unknown mechanic at Farnborough, but not that this had been done maliciously. There was no record made of the repair. The following report was issued on the 21st of June in 1913. The committee is of the opinion that the primary cause of the accident was the failure of the faulty joint in the repair to the rear main spar. A government inquiry commenced on the 11th of July in 1913. In 1914, William Joyson Hicks, MP, 1st Viscount Brentford, circa 1865 to 1932, complained of a whitewash of the matter, and that Colonel John Edward Bernard Seeley, 1st Baron Mottistone, circa 1868 to 1947, Secretary of State for War, refused to admit to the faulty repair. Further criticism came from another member in 1916. British aviator, inventor and publisher Noel Pemberton Billing, circa 1865 to 1932, head of Pemberton Billing Limited, aircraft manufacturers, who called for a judicial inquiry into the military and naval air services. He stated, certain officers had been murdered rather than killed by the carelessness, incompetence, or ignorance of their senior officers or of the technical side of those two services. The government only responded by setting up their own inquiry on the 3rd of August in 1916. This interim report concluded that pilot error and dangerous flying had caused Lieutenant Arthur's death, something that was strongly disputed by contemporary pilots in the Royal Flying Corps, where rumours abounded. Although the final report was dated on the 17th of November in 1916, it did not appear until Christmas, but it went some way at least towards exonerating Lieutenant Arthur and clearing his name. Lieutenant Desmond Arthur was buried with full military honours. The funeral procession made its way through the town of Montrose and was followed by a memorial service in St. Mary's and St. Peter's Episcopal Church on Panmure Street. Thereafter, it carried onward to Desmond's final resting place in Sleepy Hillock Cemetery. Upon the examination of Lieutenant Arthur's broken body, a locket was retrieved from the breast pocket of his uniform, inside which a miniature portrait of a young woman was enclosed, the glass having been cracked by the impact. Her name was Constance Winsome Ropner, affectionately called Wiz. Lieutenant Arthur had known the Ropner family for at least a decade prior to his death. When residing at the County Durham seaside resort of Seaton Carew in northeast England, he had formed a warm and close friendship with the young girl's parents, a successful Hartlepool shipowner, William Robert Ropner, circa 1864 to 1947, and his wife, Sarah Woolacott Corey, circa 1868 to 1948. William Ropner's father was Sir Emil Hugo Oscar Robert Ropner, 1st Baronet, circa 1838 to 1924. He was a German-British shipbuilder, ship owner, and Conservative Member of Parliament, born Röpner at Magdeburg in the Kingdom of Prussia, the son of Johann Heinrich Röpner and Johann Christian Emil Bessel. Over the years, Lieutenant Arthur spent many holidays with them at their home in Ambleside House on Elwick Road in West Hartlepool, Durham. As young Constance Winsome grew, so did love between she and Desmond. Despite the 15-year age difference, a future marriage seemed destined. Proprieties were of course always observed, and they were never alone together. She was 14 when Lieutenant Arthur departed Ambleside House for the final time. 2 weeks later, he was dead. The overwhelming grief experienced by all concerned can only be imagined. When Lieutenant Arthur's will was read at Dublin on the 9th of June in 1913, it was revealed that he had left most of his wealth, being £9,569, to Miss Constance Winsome Ropner, his intended future bride. The sum of £1,000 was bequeathed to his elder brother Charles, subject to the agreement of Miss Ropner. The will was contested by Charles Arthur, but upheld by Justice William Kenny, circa 1846 to 1921, at the Irish High Court in 1914. In order to fulfil the bequest, the Glenomera estate had to be sold. The Ropner family were obviously wealthy, so why they fought Charles W.A. Arthur in court to uphold Lieutenant Arthur's will can only be speculated upon, and why Lieutenant Arthur basically snubbed his brother also remains to be seen. Charles was also cut out of his own mother's will, perhaps because he was somewhat of a rogue, as well as having frivolously spent all of his share of the money his father had bequeathed to him. He did pay for his brother's monument at Sleepy Hillock Cemetery, however. Constance Winsome Ropner would go on to eventually marry the war hero Major George Talbot Wilcox, RFC, in October of 1922, whom she would ultimately outlive by a further 20 years. She died aged 89. She never forgot Desmond Arthur, her first love, and would name her firstborn son after him. The alleged haunting of Montrose Air Station did not happen until about 3 years after Lieutenant Arthur's death. It was during 1916 that reports of an unknown airman began to surface at Montrose. Lieutenant Arthur had never actually visited the area at any point whilst he was alive. One prominent witness was a senior flying instructor named Major Cyril Edgar Foggin, circa 1891 to 1918, who saw the ghost on a number of occasions. One evening, when he was making his way to the mess, he saw a figure going the same way, and then vanish when it reached the door. He put the sighting down to overwork, and did not initially communicate it for fear he would jeopardize his position. The paranormal researcher and author Peter Underwood wrote that Major Foggin witnessed the ghost 5 times during that autumn, and that the figure was also witnessed by the station commander and several witnesses who were flying instructors. One of the latter woke at night to see a uniformed man sitting in a chair in his room, but when he challenged it, the person vanished. The ghost made one last appearance on Christmas Eve in 1916 and then disappeared. What firmly re-established Lieutenant Desmond Arthur as the Montrose Ghost was an article by Sir Peter Masefield, the aviation journalist and former chairman of the British Airports Authority, in Flight International in December of 1972, by which time RAF Montrose had closed. In the article, Masefield repeated the original story of Lieutenant Arthur's death and the subsequent appearance of his spirit at Montrose, with an important new twist in the tale. As Masefield was leaving Dalcross, Inverness Airport, he was approached by a man who asked for a lift in the rear seat of his de Havilland Canada DHC-1 Chipmunk aircraft, so he took off with a passenger. As the Chipmunk approached Montrose, Masefield was astonished to encounter an ancient BE-2 biplane flying over the old airfield, and to his horror, he saw its wing collapse and the pilot fall from the cockpit. There was a cry from his passenger, but when Masefield turned round, there was nobody there. Badly shaken, Masefield landed at Montrose, took on petrol, and then continued his flight to Brooklands Airfield. When he went to write up his logbook, he saw that the date was the 27th of May, 1963, exactly 50 years since Desmond Arthur's fatal accident. He had witnessed a reenactment of the tragedy. Masefield stated, "Is there a Montrose ghost? And is it Desmond Arthur?" There are certainly recent sightings of apparitions of men in flying dress which defy rational explanation, but we should remember that hundreds of men were killed at Montrose over 2 world wars. Circumstances point to the existence, if that is the right term, of many ghosts. As far as Lieutenant Arthur is concerned, we should go back to the original story. He returned briefly for a purpose, and once he was cleared of the blame for the accident, he departed. We should now let him rest in peace. Robert Lawrence Binyon, English poet, dramatist and art scholar, 1869 to 1943, said, "They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them." I gratefully acknowledge the help and guidance of all those who directly or indirectly assisted in this endeavour, but particularly the following: Montrose Air Station Heritage Centre and its volunteers, Stuart Archibald, MASHC Chairman, Helen Francis Graham, Dennis Adney Graham, Hannah Helena Margaret Graham, Jonathan Christopher James Graham, Peter Baker, John Malloy, Michael Kelly, Paul Kelly, Nicholas Arthur, Paul Wilcox, Dr. Dan Payton, Sir Peter Masefield, Jason Salkey, John Tams, and the Montrose Library. This has been Lieutenant Desmond L.S. Arthur, RFC, The Life and Death of an Aviator. Written by Barry Dominic Graham, with music by Barry Dominic Graham. Narrated by Peter Baker. Copyright 2020 by Barry Dominic Graham. Production copyright 2020 by Barry Dominic Graham.